Now what I want to discuss with you a little bit is your dies, your tooling, strictly what you'll be ordering from the manufacturers, how to order it, the proper care of it, how to handle it, things of this nature. What I have in front of me here is two different types of dies. First one we'll be discussing is your engraved die. This die, the cavity is actually engraved into the steel. And if you can see here, the cavity is whatever the die shape is cut out to. It can be anything. This is basically a simple rectangle with two rectangles at the top. What this die is made to do is cut pressure sensitive material, and this die is going to cut down to the liner and stop. The way they tool a die is basically by the bearers and making the thickness of this to where the actual blade, the steel blade itself, cuts to the liner and stops. Now you can over-impress and cut too deep in a liner. You don't want to do that. If you don't impress enough, then the labels are going to pull up and the stock's not going to cut. But you want to make sure that when you order a die, that you send in sample material so that they can tool your die to that material. If they don't tool your die to the material you're cutting, the odds are it's going to cut improperly or wear out quicker. So make sure, do yourself a favor, and the die manufacturer, send in some stock. A couple other things I want to go over here is you see the gear right here. When you set your die in the press, the number one concern you have is to make sure that your gear on your die lines up with the dry gear on your die anvil. They need to be flush with each other. They don't need to be offset. They need to be centered. The way you're going to do that is by using what we call die washers, and they eat up the slack simply on the die so that you can center it up. Remember, make sure that you always oil these dies consistently. You should oil a die about once every 5,000 or 10,000 feet. That's not excessive. It may not be enough. As dies run and they heat up, they're going to dull, they expand. You want to keep them as cool as possible. Also, we'll be showing you the wipers on the press. You want to make sure that they're in place and oiled up all the time. Another critical thing about this die is these blades get damaged very easily. As you can see, I don't wear rings. Some people will wear a wedding band or something of that nature. You don't need any jewelry. Even my watch is a cloth band watch. Nothing can touch this. When you're handling a die, you need to be very, very careful. The environment around you, everything around the die needs to be taken into account to make sure that it's safe to handle that die. When you're handling the die, do not put your hand on here and slide it this way or that way. You will cut your hand wide open. I can put pressure all I want pushing down. It's not going to cut my hand. But once I slide my hand across there one way or the other or slip it, it's going to cut it. So don't do that. Another last little thing here about this die is you see we have holes drilled in here. This is simply so that we can put our eye bolts in, and we can lift the die up with the crane, which we don't use here because we have a 10-inch press. But if you have a crane, that's what it's for, so you can lift the die into place. Dies are very, very expensive. They're very easy to damage, but they're very durable if you take care of them properly. Every time you run a die, you should list the amount of cavities that you die cut with that die so that you can see that you're getting proper life out of it. If you keep up with the die cuts of the cavities of the die you're doing consistently throughout all of your dies, and you build a relationship with your die manufacturer that they trust that you're doing it properly, if your die wears out before it's time and they know that you're properly taking care of it, they'll retool it or replace it for free. Any good die company will do that. But the critical thing is make sure that you're doing your part right. We generally get 1 million impressions to 1.5 million impressions out of a soft steel die of this nature. This is one around, so that tells me I'm going to run about 1 million labels with this die, maybe 1.5 million, because we are cutting some very abrasive material with it. Now remember, on your bearers, when you're die cutting, if your stock goes up under the bearers, it's going to stop cutting. Anything on the anvil is going to affect this die also. If it's under the bearers, it won't cut. If it's under the die cavity where it's actually cutting, it's going to cut too deep all the way through the liner. So be very careful with these dies. Make sure that you run them properly. Make sure that you keep them oiled, and make sure that you don't bang them up against something. This is pretty critical because these dies are very soft along the edges. The second die I want to show you is what we call a mag die. What this die is, it's just like the steel die, with the exception it has no cavities engraved in it. It still runs bears, it still has the gear, we still put washers, everything has to be handled the same. But where this is different is we have magnetic insets on this cylinder. And they are designed to hold down a flexible die plate, which I have right here. And a flexible die plate is just like a printing plate, with the exception is a die. And you have to mount it and register it just like a printing plate. We have a score line running right across here. That score line is what I'm going to register my register lines to. And this here will simply mount down when I put it on my score. Put this one on the score. I want to get it perfectly even. Lay it down, spin it around, and it's right. Okay? So it's real easy to do. When a lot of people ask, well, do these last as long and things of that nature? I do not believe even today that the flexible dies last as long as the steel dies, but they last a very long time. Talk to your die vendor, see what kind of life they're going to get out of the material you're cutting. There's some tricks you can do on these you can't do on the other ones. Putting some tape under here help lift the edges up. Where you really see the mag die being used the most is in the laser sheet industry. You got a consistent repeat of 11 inches. The die plates are fairly inexpensive. You can buy a die plate for about $200. If you buy 4 or 5, usually you can get it down to around $150 even. In the laser jet industry, they're very popular because you can have this in your press and just change your die cut from time to time each time you change sheets. So you don't change anything else. You leave in the same sheeter and everything. You just pull off one die plate and put on the other. And that gives you very inexpensive cuts on the jet laser, and it provides you a quick setup and turnaround. So that's where we see them the most, but they are becoming more and more popular in the prime label. You do see people trying to match up jobs to run on certain cylinders that might be magnetic. But for the most part, the laser jet industry is the big user, and we do feel comfortable with the product. We use it fairly often here at the school, and it's a great tool to have in your press room. Just like anything else, though, take proper care of it. Don't let things beat or ding on these magnets. It will mess it up. They're softer. They can get dented a little bit, and you'll have a flat spot. So be careful with it, and make sure that all the tooling you use correctly. Last thing I want to show you about a die is your die blocks. On the Mark Andy 2200 we have, these are simple die blocks, one's square, one's twisted. And the reason you'll see that when we put them on the press is so that our operator side, we don't have to put the block in until after we get the drive side done. The reason that is so that we can slide it in and out. It's very pressman friendly, and then you can just adjust the washers on the outside edge once you line up the gear on the inside. The twister washer always goes on the outside, except for certain occasions when you're running a die as an underscore. Then they go vice versa, and we'll cover that out there. The most important thing about your blocks, and it don't matter if they're this type of block or grease block or whatever, make sure that you oil or grease them frequently. When these blocks go on, they have an oil hole at top. Make sure when you put them in the press that the oil hole is facing up. Otherwise, you can't oil the die while it's running. It is important that all blocks either have a way to oil the die or grease the die. If you have grease fittings on the end, grease them frequently. Don't let them sit around and not grease for a week or whatever. Make sure that you're taking care of your tooling on a day-to-day basis. And if you do that, then when it comes back to press, it'll run right for you, and everybody around the whole environment will have a lot better atmosphere to work in if your tooling's doing what it's supposed to. The most aggravating thing you can do is run a piece of tooling that's not working properly. So make sure you do your part to make the tooling work properly.